Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. Welcome back, Engagers, to another episode of the Professor Game Podcast. And today we have a special guest. Our guest is Eric. But before we kick off, Eric, are you prepared to engage?
I am prepared to engage.
Let's do this because we have an Atlanta artist, a comedian, and co-host of the Goblin's Corner. This is Eric Holden. He's also a tabletop and storytelling podcast. Well, this is a tabletop and storytelling podcast on all your favorite podcasting platforms, of course. He has been performing since he was old enough to speak and has carried this to every creative format, from various improv and live acts to sketch comedy and, of course, gaming. With also 30 plus years of running various tabletop games, he has extensive knowledge of both the industry and the performance art of storytelling overall. So you now know definitely why he's here. But he's also, you can see him in the wild building false idols to Godzilla, drinking coffee with abandon, and rolling 20-sided dice wherever fine products are sold. So Eric, is there anything we're missing from that intro?
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I am the alpha geek. So
There you go. So we always like to understand a little bit more of our guests. Of course, we know the fantastic things that you guys have been doing, but we want to know, what does a day with Eric look like? Maybe a day or a week, whatever that you want to go for.
Well, with regards to the show, my day generally starts in the evening. And the reason behind that is obviously, like many of us, I have a day job, and I also have little kids. So usually right around 8, grab a cup of coffee and start hitting the recording with my co-host, Matt. And we generally have a list of different episodes that we talk about, and most of them are thematic related or storytelling related over mechanics. But occasionally we dive into mechanics. There's just so many tabletop games out there. Most people know like D&D, but there's things like Shadowrun. There's stuff like Star Wars. There's like literally, if you did a Google search, you would find thousands of different ones. And so we want to make sure that we hit the themes and stories that appeal to everyone looking to run a game. And so we usually have like a bullet point list, and we'll go off of that. And then my friends have described the podcast very much as these two guys sitting on the back porch talking about D&D. And that's kind of how it is in terms of the format. So we're very loose in terms of what we say, and we'll go back and forth, riff a little bit, but try to help storytellers and people who are new at the game or even who've been around for a long time get better at what they're doing, which is, of course, collaborative storytelling, playing together, doing something that's fun interactively.
Sounds very interesting, especially with regards to the show. And talking about that, you've done the show, you've been improvising as well, you've been doing many interesting things. So we start strong in that way because we'd like to learn from our guests. And what better way to learn than from one of those fails or first attempts at learning? Can you tell us of a time you were, using or creating a story or, doing one of these tabletops and, things just went south? It didn't go as you were expecting. And how did you come out of it? If you did, what did you learn? What lessons came out of that experience?
I'm going to tell you the story that I tell a lot of people. When I first started playing Dungeons and Dragons or any type of role-playing game, I was what is called the train conductor, which is a type of DM. And a train conductor is a person who sets up the story. They've got everything written out. They've got everything planned out, and they don't deviate from that. And it's great if you have a linear module that you're playing or something that's very specific. You have to do this and this and this. But the reality of a lot of interactive, collaborative games like this is that nothing ever happens in a linear order. Even in video games, most video games that people enjoy the most of are open-ended in many ways. Why I like Skyrim so much, for example, or something where I can do different types of quests. And so because of that, I ended up playing horribly. I remember I had this whole dungeon set up, had a map. They were going to go in there, they're going to kill some goblins. It was like a low-level campaign. And what ended up happening was they go up to the cavern. They're like, yep, there's some goblins down there. Let's just seal off the cavern and call it a day. And so they did. And then they proceeded to do everything else but the campaign I had spent days writing. And because of that, I learned that it is better to go with a looser definition and to kind of ad lib a lot. And interestingly enough, I was a kid when this started, but that's what got me into improv of all things, and learning to take all of these things where your players will kind of, throw a curveball at you and use that as a gift to build a story from.
So the sort of yes and the mentality, right?
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. Yeah. It's gift giving, yes anding, and if that is true, what else is true? Building upon that in your game.
I think we haven't talked a lot about tabletop games here, but it is interesting, especially for people who are thinking of using the strategies from games, designing games, using things like gamification, because there are many skills that I think are very interesting to build upon. Because when you're doing improv in that way, you're coming up with things on the run. And if you can come up with things on the run, even if then you're going to design something that is more of a railroad, you are able to come up with it with more ease because you've been practicing, you've been creating stories, again, on the run. And, it should bring many tools to your toolkit to be able to do that for other instances. So I think it is a very interesting point to dive into, and a very nice approach. When you were saying it's not about having it all set up, but sometimes just bringing in and incorporating that feedback that you get from the people, especially because, again, in tabletop, you can almost do whatever you want, right?
That's correct. And, it's if you're the type of storyteller that likes to have things planned out, there are a lot of techniques that you can use to kind of guess at what your players might do. And one of the things we talk a lot about in our show is consequence of actions. If a character does something, what happens to the rest of the world in that progression, right? So if they kill the mayor of town, then, there's either going to be a new mayor elected or people are going to come after them, right? Depending on why they did this. You can do mind mapping to think about different scenarios or possible actions, because we're all people when we're telling these stories, no matter what you're playing. The person behind it is a person. And so people can have a little bit of predictability about them. And, knowing who your party of players is. For example, some of my friends are very much, we like to call them murder hobos, which just means they like to go in and, fight monsters, right? But there's a lot of other groups that maybe are more role-playing centric. There are people who are progression centric. They need like goals. And knowing who those people are when you're playing with them, or finding that out through like a session 0, allows you time to consider possibilities. And then if you are the trained conductor style, you can write those possibilities out so you're not sidelined or, with something random.
Interesting. So it's kind of taking a look and understanding the profiles of the players that you're at. And this is something that we talk a lot about when creating, again, not tabletop necessarily, but when creating any type of game or game experience, you would definitely benefit a lot the game and the fun that people will have if you understand the people who are going to be behind that.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's all about understanding people and how to tell a story with them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Eric, now we're going to take in a 180-degree spin, right? So we're going to look at, we talked about a time where things went south. Let's talk about a time when the absolute opposite happened, whether, again, the first, the second, or the nth try, where things, just went well and you were happy about it. We'd like to this could be sort of the brag moment, something that you're sort of proud about as well, of an experience that you created, something, especially if you can bring it into this tabletop gaming or something, even if you created a game for some other purpose beyond entertainment.
Let's see. We had a game several years ago where it was in the Outer Planes, which there's, and for people who may be unfamiliar with different fantasy style games, different universes of enemies. So devils and demons and angels and all kinds of really strange elemental creatures and so forth. And they were out running around the plains, this group of characters. And the way that the story was written, the overarching storyline, it almost wrote itself. And what I mean by that is I had come up with a bunch of different plot points. And then because I was doing a lot of active listening, I was really listening to what my players were saying. I kind of, they were commenting as the game was progressing. So for example, they're like, oh yeah, these monsters, man, it's almost like we're going back in time. And I was like, that's a great idea. And so I kind of just wrote that down while we're playing the game. And so the next session, maybe they were going back in time. Or, you know what? It's almost as if, they're trying to get to a specific place in It was in the Outer Planes in this campaign. And it ended up being that the original big bad that they were fighting over the overarching storyline, they ended up creating by going back in time and meeting this creature and saying, yeah, we're here to fight this guy. He's going to destroy, all of reality. And the guy's like, well, that's my name. And then you just see the look on all of the players' faces as they realize they set up their own enemy. And that was a really cool moment because they basically told the story themselves. And as a storyteller, all I did was just kind of steer them a little bit in the right direction. But they were already moving in that direction. And just with a little bit of feedback, they made their own story. And it was such a cool moment. Everybody loved that game. That's
super interesting, especially because what you were saying there, that element of surprise that took them completely off, completely off put. It's like, well, what happened here? Like, how did we do this? And it's like that moment where you see that everything ties in together, but it's also a big surprise as well that they were definitely not expecting. And I think that is a very engaging element as well. It's the kind of thing that gets people to come back, and it's definitely something that we're always looking forward to.
Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification.
So Eric, when you are, creating a tabletop game or you're creating one of these stories, I know you have a lot of improv incorporated already, and of course you've learned that throughout the years. But if you're facing, you have to create something almost from scratch, do you have some sort of mental process? How do you go about it? Are there a series of steps that you do? Like, we would like to sort of sneak into your head and see what's going on when you're creating one of these tabletop games.
Well, I have homebrewed like games themselves, and what I've found is the best way to start, in my opinion, is to figure out what's the game about. So it could be very loose in your head. It could be, sci-fi, fantasy. It could be more combat specific versus role-playing specific. All of these thematics will kind of group together and then determine basically how much rules you need. A good example of this is you could come up with an idea for a bunch of kids in high school that happen to be monsters, right? Well, there's a game system that exists out now that already has that. You could adapt a story or an idea to either existing systems, or you could write your own game system using whatever successes and failures you have. Tabletop games are, at their very core, essentially simple things to do. And the reason why is because I have an action that I want to do. And then it's really up to the storyteller or the game mechanics to say, okay, do you succeed or fail? And all you really have to determine is what do I need to put down in the rules, quote unquote, to determine success or failure? Sometimes you can have them as automatic successes and failures. Sometimes if it's something that's challenging and you want to challenge the players or leave it to chance, then you can write that down in the rules, and that's when the rolling appears. Everything else is number crunching, whether you use 20-sided dice, 10, 6s, whether you use a dice pool. And so I always start with the idea. And then my rules will be adapted either from an existing game or written myself to encompass those successes and failures.
Interesting. And at this point, maybe we should have started off by that, but just in case, some people might be saying, well, but tabletop, I've heard about this, but how would you define a tabletop game? What is a tabletop game for those people who have never heard this before?
Sure. At its basis, a tabletop role-playing game is a collaborative story with someone who generally sets the story up, often called a dungeon master or a game master or just sometimes a storyteller, and a bunch of players. Each of the players will play either a group of characters or usually one character, and they can define their traits, what they look like, how they act, and so forth, kind of like a very generic script in a play. And the game part of a tabletop game is when you are doing some kind of action in the storytelling, there are rules, depending upon the game, to determine success or failure. So that's where the rolling comes in. And in general, a character sheet that has how strong your character is or how fast they are, or maybe what kind of skills they have. but the rest of it is really just storytelling and play. I liken it a lot to playing with toys when you were a kid, just rolling some dice to determine whether you did that action or not.
Huh. Interesting. Very nice way to define it. Definitely coming especially from an expert like Eric in this whole area. I think it makes it clearer for people who might have been scratching their heads like, what is this tabletop thing going on? It's something that I have to confess has had me curious for a couple of years at least now. I remember back in school, some people were playing. It never sort of was in my avenue. But I've been getting more and more curious, and I'm definitely looking forward to joining a tabletop group at some point in the future when I have a little bit more of time, when I'm not this crunched. But it is something that is more and more appealing, at least to me. So, Eric, is there something that you could say, when you're creating a tabletop experience, when you're creating one of these games that you embark upon? Are there some sort of best practice, something that you would say, well, when you're doing this, one good thing that you could do to improve it or to make it a little bit better would be these kinds of things, or this idea, this, I don't know, whatever you want to go for there. It's an open mic.
Let's see. There's a couple things you can do to make a better game in terms of story. So we'll go story first, and then we can talk about maybe like a little bit about characters and stuff like that. I think having some basic idea that is maybe, I say epic, but big enough that you can move it around a little bit depending upon how your players act is a good first start. And I would suggest just, the typical brainstorming ideation exercises that most people do. So whether it's, writing stuff out in a bullet point, whether it's just kind of talking out your ideas or mind mapping or anything like that, have kind of a general idea of where you want to take your game. A lot of people who are writers will often write the ending and the beginning and then fill in the middle. And that sometimes works as well if you know where you want it to go. If you don't, that's totally fine as well. At least know where things start, and then you can always build from there. With regards to the players, know what your players are going to play or what they're capable of playing, and know what style of storytelling they want to play. Again, some people are really into role-playing, dramatic types of scenes. Some people don't like combat. Some people love combat. Most players in these games are a combination of something of that sort. And, if you're interested, we have a whole episode just on characters and styles and stuff like that. But, just have a basic idea of what that is. And a lot of times, depending upon how you work, you could just write all this stuff down and have kind of a idea book where you just jot ideas down when you have time. This is a really great thing because you can build encounters ahead of time, whether it's combat encounters, role-playing encounters, or what have you, and then see where you can fit them into your overarching storyline. You don't have to come up with everything on the fly. And if you're good at doing that, then more power to you. But even I would like kind of a general idea of where my game is heading.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. In fact, I was thinking, like, when you were talking about that, it seems like it's understanding the people who are there so that when you get into that creation phase, of course, you have a lot of tools and say, well, if you are this type, maybe these types of characters. If it's a mix of these things, you have these other characters. It makes a lot of sense. It's understanding, again, it's sort of, we're circling back to one of the things that we said at the start. It's understanding who you are creating for. And this is a design discipline in general, game design. Game master is a game designer at essence, right?
And I would also add to that, know the limitations of the game you'll be playing. So a good example of that is some games are very good with fast combat or dramatic types of role-playing. Some games are very slow with those things. And so know ahead of time what the type of game you're playing and its potential pitfalls so you can work around that.
Makes sense. Makes a lot of sense, in fact. So that's a great recommendation, Eric. And we would like to know, now that you've listened to most of the questions of the podcast, you've sort of gotten the vibe of it. Is there somebody that comes to your head like, now that I think of it, I'd like to listen to this person responding or answering to these questions? Somebody come to your mind?
There's a podcast we actually are friends with. They're called Billowing Hilltop. And those guys are just a bunch of Brits that play D&D, right? I think they play Age of Worms using Pathfinder. And they play for fun. And it's clear that they're not worried about anything but having fun. And I think that's a really cool golden rule, because why do we play games in general, regardless whether it's a video game, a board game, a tabletop game, or why do we are so interested in gaming in general? It's because it's entertainment. It's something that we enjoy doing. And so I would totally recommend those guys anytime.
Yeah, sort of thinking about the fun, to start with. And sometimes, again, you might be thinking of, oh yeah, this game is supposed to be fun, but it's also supposed to be educating you on something, and you focus on the education and then forget, all about the fun. And that's definitely not going to cut it.
Sure.
So it makes a lot of sense to make sure that you keep that front of mind as well. So Eric, you're talking recommendations. Is there any other recommendation as far as books that you could give to our listeners or the engagers?
In terms of books for gaming?
Yeah, gaming or game design, or even, being a dungeon master, perhaps.
I think any of the art of storytelling books would be a good recommendation. And I don't have any specific ones in mind, but any book that teaches you how to tell stories is really good. I would recommend, if you are looking to expand your storytelling capabilities, an improvised book called Improvised by Mick Napier is excellent, and that actually helps you learn how to think on the fly and tell stories from that. My day job is a user experience designer, so I would recommend many of the user experience books, because it's funny when you're designing a dungeon, for example, if you're making that dungeon map or whatever, you want to think about, why is this trap here when the person's going to walk through or something like that? So building things smartly, and even constructing cities in your head or writing them down, you kind of need to know, why is this city built, for example, or why does this country exist, or why does the society have this particular type of magic or ruler or whatever. And so I think learning a little bit about a user experience would be very good. So the Nelson Norman books on user experience, or any of the other ones that could teach you some of that. I think it's funny, none of those are really game books, but they will help you get better at telling games and playing games, I think. Interesting
couple of books, at least. You did mention one on storytelling, on improv, in fact, and that one's certainly going to jot down. And then the author of those books on UX could be very, very interesting to look at as well, because we're always designing experiences in one way or another. So thinking about the experience of your users, your players, however you want to call them, is something very, very important. And I like to use the word players, especially because you're considering that they're also doing something. When it's users, they're just using your product. When they're players, they're moving the story forward. They're changing things by themselves, which is quite interesting.
That's
as
correct.
A concept.
Yeah, and that's very important to note, because unlike mini games, they actively participate in making your world. And a lot of beginning storytellers don't think about that a lot of times. You don't have to make everything. You just have to make enough that the players can fill in the blanks. And they will. And they will give you those gifts that you can then use to piggyback off of and make even more stuff that they can then fill in the blanks. And so it's a very symbiotic relationship.
Indeed, absolutely. So that makes a lot of sense. That's a great recommendation to focus on that. We're again talking about the players, the users. As you can see, we're very user-centric in that sense, and we love that. And talking about recommendations, this is probably going to be one of the most difficult ones, because we would like to know, what would you consider is your favorite game?
Oh, you have to ask me any day of the week, I'd probably tell you a different one. I will tell you that obviously I grew up playing a lot of D&D. My first game was Marvel Superheroes, of all things, with a D10 system.
Huh. Interesting.
If I were to recommend a fun game to play, I would say one probably most people haven't played is Deadlands. And Deadlands is a really interesting, it's a Wild West campaign. It's set in the 1800s, right after the Civil War, but magic has come back. And so everything is completely changed. Half of California is under the ocean. There's monsters roaming around. People cast spells by drawing from decks of cards. So it's got a really cool thematic element to it. The game system's really neat, and you can play a lot of interesting, varied characters in the Wild West. They call it the Weird West. And so I would highly recommend Deadlands to someone wanting to play something a little different, or even if you've never played before.
Deadlands, that would be a fantastic recommendation, which I have not played. It sounds very, very interesting for sure. And what would you say, Eric? We've recommended other things, other people, other games done by other people. But what would you say is your superpower when, creating these stories, creating these experiences in tabletops?
My ability as a storyteller is a world builder. So I tend to have the 1,000-foot stare, overarching story themes, mass continent building, world building type skills. I tend to suffer a bit when it comes to details, and so I usually fall back on my players for that. But if you need some kind of creative, unique world, that's my superpower right there.
Very nice, very important, very interesting, and very useful, especially
Sure.
in your space. So anyways, Eric, before we kick off, we want to make sure that the audience can know more about the Goblin's Corner, more about Eric Holden in general. Where can we find you in the world of the internet? Where are those places? What are those touch points that we can have with you, your podcast, and your work? And of course, if you have any final words, any final piece of advice, it's also very welcome.
Sure. You're welcome to find us all. We're all over the social media. We are Goblin's Corner on Facebook, at Goblin's Corner on Twitter. We have a Instagram, The Goblin's Corner, Pinterest, Goblin's Corner. You see the Goblin's Corner, Goblin's Corner, Goblin's Corner. Keep going. All of our stuff is on goblinscorner.com. And of course, if you're interested in listening to our podcast, we're on all the players from Spotify and everything else. So feel free to hit us up. We love feedback.
Neat. Glad to have you on the show. Thank you very much for investing this time. We're talking over a weekend right now, so thank you for investing this time, Eric, talking with the engagers, giving away your experience, your knowledge. However, at least for now and for today, you have to say that it's game over. Hey, engagers, thank you for listening to Professor Game Podcast, and I'd like to know, how are you listening to this podcast? Because if you're doing it through a podcasting app, we would like you to subscribe and rate this podcast. Please do so if you haven't. That way we can reach more engagers like you to increase our community and achieve our mission of making learning amazing. If you need instructions, we have a few of the apps in professorgame.com/iTunes. So the letter I and then tunes. professorgame.com/iTunes. And before you go on to your next mission, remember to go to that app, subscribe, and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.